The history of commercial aviation, from Wright Brothers to today. Imagine stepping onto an aircraft, settling into your seat, and casually crossing an entire ocean in under 8 hours. Today, we accept this as completely ordinary. But barely more than a century ago, the idea that human beings could fly at all was considered the fantasy of dreamers and madmen. So how did we get from a rickety wooden glider on a windy beach in North Carolina to a world where over 4 billion passengers board commercial flights every single year? That is exactly the story we are telling today, and it is one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history. To understand where commercial aviation began, we have to start at the very beginning, on the morning of December 17, 1903. Orville and Wilbur Wright, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, had spent years studying the aerodynamics of birds, testing gliders, and running calculations that professional engineers had dismissed. At Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville climbed aboard the Wright Flyer, a fragile machine of spruce wood, muslin fabric, and a 12-horsepower engine the brothers had built themselves. The first flight lasted just 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. By the end of that same morning, Wilbur had flown 852 feet in 59 seconds. Nobody who witnessed it fully grasped what it meant. The world had just changed forever. Within a decade, aviation fever swept across Europe and North America. Stunt pilots, daredevils, and military experimenters pushed aircraft technology at an almost reckless speed. World War I became an unintentional but powerful accelerator of aviation development. Governments poured money into aircraft manufacturing, engine research, and pilot training on a scale that peacetime investment could never have justified. By the end of the war in 1918, aircraft could fly faster, farther, and more reliably than anything the Wright brothers had imagined. Suddenly, the infrastructure, the factories, the pilots, and the mechanical knowledge all existed. The question became obvious: could flying become a business? The answer arrived on January 1, 1914, technically predating the war's greatest impact. A man named Abram Field paid $400 at auction for the honor of becoming the first paying airline passenger in history. The route was from St. Petersburg to Tampa, Florida, a distance of about 21 miles, piloted by Tony Johnews aboard a 2-seat flying boat. The entire journey took 23 minutes compared to the 2-hour ferry ride it replaced. St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line ran for about 4 months before shutting down due to poor finances. It was small, fragile, and commercially unsuccessful. But it planted a seed. The 1920s witnessed the first serious efforts to build sustainable commercial airlines. In the United States, the Kelly Air Mail Act of 1925 allowed the government to contract private carriers to deliver mail by air, which gave fledgling airlines a reliable revenue stream to survive early years of passenger skepticism. Pan American Airways, founded in 1927, began with a mail contract between Key West and Havana, Cuba. In Europe, Imperial Airways launched in Britain and Lufthansa in Germany, both backed by government subsidies that recognized aviation as a matter of national prestige and strategic importance. Passengers in this era flew in noisy, turbulent, often unpressurized cabins and traveled slowly by today's standards. A transatlantic crossing was still out of reach for most. Then came the watershed moment, Charles Lindbergh's solo non-stop transatlantic flight in May 1927. He flew 33.5 hours from New York to Paris in the spirit of St. Louis and became the most famous man on Earth overnight. Lindbergh's achievement did something crucial that technical specifications alone could not. It captured the public imagination. Suddenly, ordinary people started believing that air travel might be part of their future. Airline passenger numbers in the United States roughly doubled in the 12 months following his flight. The 1930s brought the first genuine golden age of commercial aviation. The Douglas DC-3, introduced in 1936, is arguably the most important commercial aircraft ever built. It could carry 21 passengers, cruise at nearly 180 miles per hour, and for the first time, actually made money carrying passengers rather than just mail. By 1939, the DC-3 was carrying over 90% of all American airline traffic and operating on routes across Europe, Asia, and Australia. Airlines like TWA, United, and American were building real businesses. Pan American launched glamorous transoceanic flying boat service with the China Clipper, connecting San Francisco to Manila and later New York to Europe. Tickets were extraordinarily expensive, but for the wealthy, flying became something genuinely exciting and aspirational. World War II, like the first, transformed aviation technology with breathtaking speed. The demands of global conflict forced engineers to develop more powerful engines, better navigation systems, pressurized cabins, and jet propulsion. By 1945, aircraft performance had advanced by decades compared to what existed in 1939. When peace returned, all of that technology was available for commercial adaptation. The returning veterans also came back having experienced long-distance travel in ways their parents never had. Horizons had expanded psychologically as well as technically. The jet age arrived commercially on May 2, 1952, when the British de Havilland Comet became the first commercial jet airliner to enter service, operating for BOAC between London and Johannesburg. The Comet was revolutionary and beautiful, cutting flight times dramatically and flying above much of the turbulence that made propeller flights uncomfortable. But catastrophic accidents in 1953 and 1954, caused by metal fatigue around the aircraft's square windows, led to the entire Comet fleet being grounded. The investigation was one of the most important in aviation history and established principles of aircraft safety testing still used today. The Americans watched closely and learned. Boeing responded with the 707, which entered commercial service with Pan American in October 1958. The 707 was larger, faster, and had benefited directly from studying the Comet's tragic failures. It crossed the Atlantic in roughly 6 to 7 hours and made intercontinental air travel genuinely practical for business travelers. Douglas launched the competing DC-8 the same year. The race between American manufacturers established a pattern of fierce competition that would ultimately benefit passengers enormously through innovation and gradually falling prices. The single most transformative aircraft in commercial aviation history arrived on February 9, 1969, when the Boeing 747 took its first flight. The jumbo jet was staggering in its ambition. It could carry over 400 passengers, nearly 4 times more than a 707, and its massive capacity drove ticket prices down dramatically. Pan American began 747 service between New York and London in January 1970, and everything changed. Flying was no longer just for the wealthy or the business elite. The 747 democratized air travel. By the late 1970s, deregulation in the United States allowed new low-cost carriers to enter the market, pushing fares even lower and driving passenger numbers into entirely new territory. The final decades of the 20th century saw commercial aviation become the backbone of global mobility. The Concorde, that beautiful supersonic aircraft jointly developed by Britain and France, entered service in 1976 and flew passengers across the Atlantic in just 3.5 hours. It was a technological triumph and a commercial niche product simultaneously. Only 14 ever flew for passengers, operating for Air France and British Airways until retirement in 2003. Meanwhile, the workhorse narrow-body jets, particularly the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320, were redefining short and medium-haul travel with incredible reliability and efficiency. Airbus, the European consortium founded in 1970, grew from an ambitious political project into a genuine competitor capable of challenging Boeing's dominance on every single market segment. The 21st century introduced an era defined by two competing forces, the pursuit of efficiency and the explosion of global demand. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A350 both used carbon fiber composite construction, cutting fuel consumption dramatically compared to older aluminum aircraft and enabling new ultra-long-haul routes that would have been uneconomical previously. Singapore Airlines operates the world's longest commercial flight, from Singapore to New York, covering over 9,000 miles in approximately 18.5 hours non-stop. The low-cost carrier revolution, led by airlines like Southwest in America, Ryanair in Europe, and AirAsia in Southeast Asia, opened flying to hundreds of millions of people who would otherwise never have boarded an aircraft.